Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special webinar series, which will be the British Association for Local History hosting in partnership with the Historic Towns Trust. For those of you who haven't joined a webinar before, if we could ask that you put your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. We will answer those questions at the end of the session, and feel free to type in the chat where you are this evening. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Caroline Barron to introduce our guest this evening. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you, Megan, and good evening, everyone. I'm Caroline Barron, and I'm wearing two hats tonight, both of which I'm very proud of because I'm the president of the British Association for Local History, and I'm a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust. And it's great that these two organizations have come together this evening. Just want to say a couple of words about them before I introduce Vanessa Harding. The BALH, the British Association for Local History, founded in 1982 to raise the profile really of local history, which was perhaps not considered to be as serious history as political history or national history. And as a result of COVID, one of the silver linings to that horrid cloud has been that people have, in a sense, been driven, if you like, to think more about local history. They have walked outside and around their local house, their local town, their local village. They've read more. And of course, they've looked at the British Association Local History website. And there's a tremendous amount of new material that the association has put onto its website as a result, really, of the pandemic. There have been 10-minute videos, there are lectures, there are webinars like tonight, there are evening discussions. There's a lot of new publication about how to read local documents. There's all sorts of things, and I'm sure many of you know the website. If you don't, do look at it. And one of the things I particularly wanted to draw your attention to tonight is the drop-down menu, which is for the Society's directory. This is you can drop down menu there and you can click onto your particular county. Now, some of you will know this, but others may not. And in that, you will find all the local associations, or as many of them as we can find, that operate in your county. So if you've got excited about local history and you're not already a member of some local history society, look at that drop-down menu, find a society and join it, because it will be great when we're able to do things back in person to go to some meetings that they've organized. So that's the BALH, if you like. And to turn now to the Historic Towns Trust, which is actually an older association than the BALH. It was founded in the 1960s. It stands for the Historic Towns Trust publishes atlases originally of historic towns in the aftermath of the Second World War, when so many historic towns have been destroyed or damaged. There was a need that they should be mapped and studied in their own right, as it were. And so the British, and that's a European organization, not just British. And the British Historic Towns Trust has published 18 atlases covering a range of towns. And if you look at our website, you can find those atlases and find out which towns have already been covered. And more recently, in the last 15 years, we've started to publish not just the atlases, which are quite substantial volumes and quite expensive, and we've published folding maps of individual towns, which are quite cheap and are tremendously good value. And I do urge you to look at them. We've done maps. I've got a list here. We've done maps of Winchester, Hull, Oxford, Canterbury, York, Bristol, Coventry, Alnwick, and one of Beverley is coming out in the next few days. And we have in prospect maps of Swansea, Chester, Perth, Exeter, Lincoln, Dover, Ripon, and Bath. So if you're keen to have a map of your local historic town, get in touch. You have to have a good organization of some local enthusiasts, a local civic society or something like that. And we have to raise about 10 to 15 pounds for any map. But if you're keen and enthusiastic, do get in touch with us and we can discuss it. But tonight, we're going to look at two of the maps, particularly, that the Historic Towns Trust has produced of London. And just to say, of course, London is different or has posed particular difficulties because unlike the other maps, which start with an Ordnance Survey map done in the 19th century and work backwards, as it were, you can't do that for London because London has grown too great and has had too many, if you like, disasters strike it, that it isn't possible to use an Ordnance Survey map of the 19th century. And so Vanessa Harding and I have been engaged together on creating a map of medieval London and also a map of Tudor London on the eve of one of those great destructive waves that struck London, which was the dissolution of the religious houses in the 1530s. Another destructive force was the huge growth of London particularly in the 16th, 17th centuries. I'm sure Vanessa will talk of that. And of course, the destruction of the fire of 1666. So now Vanessa is an ideal person to talk to us tonight because she knows about medieval London, and she and I have worked together on looking at the wharves and lanes that bordered the Thames and the difficulties of trying to work out which lanes had which names because they kept changing their names because the tenements on either side had new owners. But whereas I have stuck in the medieval period and really don't go beyond the dissolution of great religious houses, Vanessa has bravely moved forward in time and has looked at the 16th century and at the 17th century, and is now particularly concerned with a Historic Towns project, which we are hoping to get off the ground, which is looking at and trying to map London on the eve of the Great Fire to cover the years between the dissolution of the religious houses and the fire of 1666. And so it's particularly exciting that Vanessa is going to give us some sort of preview of what that work might be like. And so her talk tonight, and she's an ideal person to do. I should say that Vanessa is also a trustee, as I am, of the Historic Towns Trust. And she's going to look at the reconstructing of London, or reconstructing London, on the eve of the Great Fire of 1666. So Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Let me start by sharing my screen and then we'll take it from there. Okay, Megan, is that right?
That's all working wonderfully, Vanessa.
Perfect, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to start by thanking you, the BALH, for this invitation or for allowing me to speak in this series, and to say that I'm very pleased and very excited to be associated with this whole series of talks and to be learning more about the BALH as we go along. And as Caroline said, I'm going to be talking about reconstructing London on the eve of the Great Fire. I won't say a great deal about the medieval and Tudor maps because that's water under the bridge. So it's the new prospect that I'm going to be talking about. And we start as local historians being familiar with the idea that that we inhabit a present that is shaped by the past, both culturally and physically. The built environment that we encounter every day is the product of decades or even centuries of accumulated change and development. Sometimes the past is very visible in the present. Elements such as buildings, names, street lines, road lines, street plans, even the ownership of property may survive to the present day. But much evidence, as we know, has been submerged and forgotten over time. But again, as local historians, we know that our research can illuminate processes of change and can recover past realities and experiences that are otherwise lost to view. The aim of historical mapping is to reconstruct vanished townscapes so that we can more clearly see how the present and the past are related. Different approaches and methods are possible, using a very wide range of written, pictorial, and cartographic sources, depending on what's available for any given place. But I think that one important objective for the outcomes of such a process should be comparability over time and from one place to another. Comparison over time is obviously fundamental to what we do, but comparison of one town with another allows us to understand generalized processes of urban development, change, and decay, and to identify the influence of factors such as location, terrain, climate, political geography, and power, as well as the impact of changes in demography, transport, communications, and technology. For comparison via mapping to work best, we need a common map scale, ideally geographically accurate, and where possible, common mapping conventions. And as Caroline said, the British Historic Towns Trust has been engaged in such an endeavour for more than 50 years, publishing historical atlases and now standalone sheet maps of British towns to a common scale and style. And it's part of the wider Atlas project of the International Commission for the History of Towns, which was established, as Caroline said, after the Second World War. And the different member countries of the International Atlas project all have slightly different conventions and methods of presentation or publication, but Atlas publications all centre on a base map of 1 to 2,500, showing the town or city somewhere between around 1840 and the early 20th century, accompanied by text and other images, including smaller maps. And as a result of this, we're in an excellent position to compare the appearance, the historical evolution of places as distant as Banbury, Bristol, Beverley, and with Belfast, Buda, Bologna, or Bordeaux. So what we do in the British Historic Towns Trust conforms to this overall scheme, but in addition to Atlas volumes, the Trust has also developed a series of town and city maps, often, but not always, as part of an Atlas project. And both the main maps in the Atlas volumes and the standalone maps present a map at 1 to 2,500 of the town in the mid-19th or early 20th century, with historic features added, even when they weren't directly visible at one time, as, for example, here for York. And these maps are therefore palimpsests, like the townscape they represent, a multi-layered record with features of different dates superimposed. And they allow the reader to triangulate, so to speak, between the present that one inhabits, the Victorian or Edwardian town that we hold in our hands, and the earlier features that help to shape both. And I should, like Caroline, put in a plug here for the Historic Towns Trust and its ambitious project of new maps and Atlas projects, aiming to extend our geographical range and to cover the three nations more evenly, as well as covering towns with different developmental histories. And in every case, we partner with local experts and enthusiasts who are primarily responsible for the input of knowledge and support. I should say that Caroline said we need to raise 10 to 15 pounds for each map. I'm afraid it's 10 to 15,000 pounds, which is a little bit more challenging. But even so, we are very keen to hear from people who are interested in taking such a thing further. However, to return to the maps already published rather than the ones we may yet do, these are mostly multi-layered composite maps highlighting historic features of all periods, but in a couple of cases, we've done something rather different, aiming to show a town or a city at one moment in time. So in 2020, we published a map of Bristol in around 1480. The date was chosen because the medieval William of Worcester's description of the city at that time, and because Bristol in the late 15th century was a flourishing port city, engaged in the Bordeaux wine trade, the Iceland trade, and in further ventures, but not yet transformed into the world trade city that it was to become by the 18th century. And the map, as you can see here, superimposes the features of the city in 1480 on an early 20th century Ordnance Survey map background that has been faded back, like our new standard mapping format. And this is really good at allowing the reader to see the relationship between the medieval city and its modern successor, and I think enriches our knowledge of both. Our two London sheet maps, as Caroline said, show the medieval and early Tudor London city, but these are a rather different style. They're essentially completely redrawn maps. They were developed from the Reconstruction maps published in volume 3 of the Atlas series in 1989, but have been rescaled, geo-rectified, recolored, and with quite a lot of new information and corrections. Each of them shows London at a single period, the medieval one of around 1270 to 1300, the Tudor one at around 1520. But the principle of comparability isn't abandoned, since both maps are available on the website Layers of London, where they can be overlaid or underlaid with other identically scaled maps to visualize the process of change in a different way. And London is, as Caroline said, a good case for a series of one period maps because it's so large, so old, so populous, so constantly changing. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to make sense of it with a multi-period map. But what I want to talk about today is a third London map project, how we are approaching making a map of Stuart London on the eve of the Great Fire of September 1666. And the aim is to complement the medieval and Tudor London maps with a third map to the same scale, though in a slightly different style, showing London as it had changed over the intervening century and a half. Now, I imagine that the majority of the audience today are probably not historians of London, but I hope that the discussion of problems and sources peculiar to London will nevertheless ring some bells with you and perhaps suggest new ways of thinking about and envisioning your own locality. The city that we mapped in 1520 was on the brink of a radical transformation as a result of the Reformation that swept away the monasteries and friaries, and of the flood of migration and immigration that took London from a compact, concentric city of some 50 to 60,000 people at the beginning of the 16th century to a sprawling metropolis of over 500,000 by the end of the 17th. A map of London in the early 1660s will show that transformation in progress, a new modern metropolis still studded with medieval buildings before the fire that destroyed the city centre and in the early stages of the east-west polarization that characterized the Georgian and Victorian capital. London in the early 1660s was a remarkable place, tense, vibrant, expansive, confident, and anxious at the same time. It was the London of the young Samuel Pepys, the early Royal Society, the expanding overseas trading companies, and a revived royal court. The restoration of the monarchy gave a boost to the capital's economy, stimulating demand for housing, entertainment, and fashionable retail. And at the same time, mercantile wealth was growing as English trade expanded, notably into the transatlantic and East Indian trades. Historical mapping draws on several different kinds of evidence: cartographic, documentary, pictorial, and physical, standing buildings and archaeological remains. And the quantity and quality of these varies from one town to another, but there will be some commonalities. When I was thinking about making this presentation, I initially thought I would structure it around the types of sources that we will use, looking at maps and documents and so on. But I quickly realized that a more integrated approach, focusing on particular problems or issues, would work better, since this is in practice how maps are actually made. We found that we have to proceed with different sources simultaneously, bring them into dialogue with one another, while respecting the different kinds of evidence that they offer. So I'm going to focus on three elements or issues, whatever you want to call them, that we need to get right in any map: the street lines and layout, the names on the map, and specific features such as churches, company halls, noble and aristocratic palaces. And I think it's also worth saying that we should probably think in terms of there being three Londons at this time, each with its own problems: the city centre that was burnt, the rest of the medieval city, inside and outside the walls, that escaped the fire, and the suburbs that came into existence in the century leading up to the fire. So I'll start by talking about reconstructing the outline street plan of London before the fire. Sorry, I've just... all historical mapping involves some degree of editing back, starting with an accurate surveyed map, usually of the 19th century, and subtracting features and changes between the source map and the period we want to show, and restoring lost ones. So for street outlines for London as a whole, the three main sources are the Ordnance Survey base map, which does in fact underlie even the medieval and Tudor maps, the earliest plan form maps of London from the 1670s and 1680s, and the pre-fire pictorial maps of the 1640s and 50s. And by way of illustration, I'm going to take a section of the city just outside the wall. It has Aldgate, the gate and the city wall, and the beginning of Whitechapel High Street. The area was outside the line of the fire of 1666, but very close to the edge of the metropolis as it then was. And this, as you can see, is from our map of early Tudor London, showing the city around 1520. And you can easily see the line of Whitechapel High Street leading out towards Stepney and eventually to Essex. Likewise, I think you can see the curve of the Roman city wall and the extramural streets of Houndsditch and the Minories to north and south. The medieval church of St. Botolph Aldgate stands just outside the gate, and that's a useful fixed point in some of the maps I'm going to be showing in a minute. While there's some ribbon development, there's not much infill as yet. Obviously, this map is not in itself a primary source. It's based on evidence and the interpretation of evidence, but it's a good way of highlighting the main features of the area. So if we now turn to what the Ordnance Survey can show us, this is the map at 1 to 1056 of the area in 1893 to 4. It's a bit greyed down, but I hope that you can see fairly clearly that the area is both the same and completely different. It's now densely built up and cut through by railway lines, but the strong diagonal of Whitechapel High Street still dominates. The city wall has largely disappeared from sight, but Houndsditch and the Minories still mark its line. And a new church of St. Botolph Aldgate, rebuilt in the 18th century, stands on the site of the medieval church. For our purposes, a large-scale Ordnance Survey map needs to be chosen, digitized, and scaled to our base. And we haven't actually got to this stage for London yet. So here is a reminder of the Bristol 1480 map, the cartographic style that we'll be using for this new map, to show how this will work in practice. A greyed down base here with the 1480 streets in colour and churches and other buildings of the period superimposed. And I hope the London map will look something like this, but we have, as you will see, quite a long way to go. Once we have a digitized version of a large-scale Ordnance Survey map as a secure base, we can move back to the immediate post-fire period, when the first surveyed plan form maps were published. A cartographic survey of the whole of London was commissioned soon after the fire, and the resulting hand-drawn surveys were embodied in several different published formats. We're starting here with Ogleby and Morgan's map of the city, published in 1676 or 1677, at a scale of 100 feet to the inch, which is something like 1 to 1200. This is fairly soon followed by Morgan's map of the whole metropolis in 1682, at a rather smaller scale, something like 14.5 inches to the mile, or 1 to 4,300. They have different virtues. Ogleby and Morgan is earlier and larger scale, but it only covers the city, omitting the spreading and populous suburb. Morgan is smaller in scale and later, but it covers the whole metropolis. A third map, complementing both, is Wenceslas Holler's pictorial map of 1675, covering the whole metropolis, drawing on the post-fire surveys and his own work in the 1650s on a large multi-sheet map of London, which was never completed. It's important to note that while surveyed to the standards of the time, these maps need quite a bit of adjustment to fit the Ordnance Survey maps of the 19th and 20th centuries, let alone the geo-rectified and geo-referenced maps of today. It's also important to be aware of several anachronisms. So Ogleby and Morgan, for example, show a new St. Paul's Cathedral, which wasn't in fact completed for another 40 years. They also show a planned Thameside quay, which was never fully implemented, while Holler's map shows the old Royal Exchange, which was destroyed in the fire. But together, these maps confirm the network of streets and the extent of the built-up area in the 1670s and 1680s. And it would, in fact, be comparatively straightforward to map them onto an Ordnance Survey base to get a modern historical map of later Stuart London. But of course, we're aiming for a map of London before the fire. It's a period of rapid change and development, partly itself the result of the fire, driving society and commerce west and east. So we certainly can't assume that a street or feature that was there in 1682 or even in 1676 was necessarily there before 1666. So for the shape and extent of the metropolis as a whole before the fire, I think we should be comparing the 1676 and 82 maps with the pictorial maps of London made in the 1640s and 1650s. And the most complete of these is the exact delineation of the cities of London and Westminster and the suburbs thereof that was published by Faithorne and Newcourt in 1658. It takes us back nearly 10 years before the fire, and actually maybe more, because it was based on surveys of the early 1640s. So there is always the question of how much had changed by the time they published it. And its different conventions, its pictorial aspect, make it an approximation rather than an accurate plan. There's also the matter of scale. It's hard to work out exactly what that is, but it appears to be about 1 to 5,000 or 5,300. That is to say, quite a bit smaller even than Morgan. As well as Faithorne and Newcourt, which has its virtues and its problems, in the 1650s, the artist and mapmaker Wenceslas Holler planned a large multi-sheet map of London that would have been about twice the scale of Faithorne and Newcourt, but only one taster sheet for Drury Lane and Covent Garden was published in 1658. However, Holler seems to have drawn on his existing surveys and sketches for the part of his map of burnt London, shown here on the left, as well as his involvement with the official surveys of the burnt area, and taken together with his map of 1675, they give us some useful information and insight into pre-fire London. Comparing Faithorne and Newcourt, seen above to the left, and Holler to the left, lower left, with Ogleby and Morgan on the right, for example, we can see that to reconstruct London before the fire, we would need to subtract at least some, but not all, of the network of streets and alleyways spreading over the fields to the east of the city. However, documentary rather than cartographic sources will have an increasingly important part to play in identifying streets and features before the fire, as I'll be explaining in a minute. The maps themselves will only take us so far, but we always need to check and correlate what they show or appear to show with other kinds of evidence. Now, while the steps I've been describing so far for recovering street lines, that is, coordinating a surveyed Ordnance Survey map with earlier, less accurate ones, whether plan form or pictorial, that's an approach that could be applied to most towns and cities. But for central London, for the City of London before the fire, we have a unique set of problems, but also a unique set of sources. The fire of the 2nd to the 6th of September, 1666, burnt out the city centre, destroying some 13,000 houses, rendering perhaps 60,000 people homeless. It burnt numerous public buildings, from the Royal Exchange to the city's Guildhall, 89 parish churches and St. Paul's Cathedral, and indeed several £1 million worth of domestic and commercial goods. Ironically, however, the fire, or rather the subsequent rebuilding, generated sources that actually make recovery of the early Stuart street plan somewhat easier. As is generally known, while several imaginative proposals for rebuilding the city along more rational or geometrical lines were put forward, and you can see one of them illustrated here, though I don't think anybody took it at all seriously. The idea of dividing the city up into a grid of this kind takes no account of the underlying topography, the slopes of the city, let alone the needs of the population. So quite a number of plans were put forward, but wholesale replanning was deemed impracticable, far too costly in time and money. By the time London had been rebuilt, essentially the centre of commerce and of wealth would have moved outside the walls, and the city authorities themselves were therefore very reluctant to take any such steps. In practice, the streets were rebuilt much as before, but with a few exceptions. The opportunity was taken to widen and straighten some streets, to lay out a couple of new ones, to relocate the food markets to off-street sites, and to improve landing facilities along the commercial waterfront. The City of London stepped up pretty impressively to the challenge of organising and directing the rebuilding, collaborating with the Crown and Parliament to have the city surveyed, to set out regulations for rebuilding, and to secure funding for public works. The overall survey of the city, and this is a version of the one that was originally done, is very valuable because it includes notes on street widths and sketches of some of the intended improvements. The new line that laid out here in red is the King Street, Queen Street, running down from Guildhall to the Thames, which was laid out. It's one of the very few completely new streets laid out after the fire. But you can see that though this is a sketch map, it includes a lot of really valuable information. Big maps are one thing, but for the present project, for accurately mapping the pre-fire streets, what's most important is the city's system for controlling private rebuilding, requiring owners to have their foundations surveyed by one of the city-appointed surveyors before beginning to rebuild, as well as dictating minimum room heights, scantlings, and materials. And this generated an enormous amount of documentation in the Corporation of London's archives, now in the London Metropolitan Archives. The surveyors who did the individual plans were also responsible for staking out the new street lines, such as King Street and Queen Street, and certifying the owner's right to compensation if part of his land was cut off for street widening. To start the process, the individual owner or rebuilder registered his request for a survey of his plot by paying the sum of 6 halfpence per foundation to the city, and this payment was entered both in a day book and in a book organised by location. One of the surveyors then came to the plot, measured it, made a note or a sketch plan recording the measurements and abutments, gave the owner a certificate to that effect, and kept a copy in his notebook. Now, not all the surveys survive. Surveyors Peter Mills and John Oliver evidently turned in their survey notebooks to the city, but Robert Hooke, yes, that Robert Hooke, failed to do so. So there are gaps even here. However, Mills and Oliver's surveys were transcribed in the 18th century and published by the London Topographical Society, along with the Foundation's posting book, which together make an invaluable contribution to this kind of research. Though these surveys are sometimes a bit cryptic, in general, they are rich in detail. And as Jones and Redaway, who edited the London Topographical Society edition of Mills and Oliver's surveys, as they showed, they allow us to create a jigsaw puzzle to reconstituting the plot layout before the fire. Now, for the present project, this isn't something we're planning to do in full, not least because the scale of our map will not really be large enough. But where it has been done, we will draw on it. And certainly the evidence for street line alterations contributes to our programme. What I'm showing here are Jones and Redaway's reconstructions of the block of properties between the street called Poultry and the street called Butlersbury. And one of the post-fire improvements was to cut back or to widen Poultry quite considerably, which meant cutting off a lot of land at one end and somewhat giving some land back to property owners at the other end. I should say that much of the work to create a street map, to create a street outline map using these sorts of sources for the city before the fire has already been done. The original Historic Towns Trust cartographer, Colonel Henry Johns, and his team used Leake's exact survey and other mapping bases to create the base for the map that was published in the 1989 Atlas, shown here in a not very clear view, I have to say, and which we reused with some modification and geo-rectification for the recent medieval and Tudor maps. So we do have a street outline map for the city itself, and we can see how we can make that. But of course, as I noted already, London in the 1660s is much more than the burnt city. The next problem we come to is names. A map is not just lines on a page, it has to identify and note and to name features. And one of our aims is to produce an accurate street directory for London on the eve of the fire. For this, we need to know not only what streets existed and where they ran, but also what they were called by contemporaries. And in a densely built up city like London, there's a profusion of names to deal with. The names of most of the major streets were well established by the 16th century, but it's the small streets and alleys and the new streets laid out in the huge expansion of London after the early 16th century that will need to be carefully researched. Ogilvy and Morgan's city map and Morgan's Greater London map were both published with extensive street directories keyed to the maps, and these obviously provide a useful starting point. As before, however, the fact that a street is named in 1676 or 1682 doesn't mean we can assume it was there earlier. It might be a new name for an old street or a new street altogether. So we need to check them all against earlier sources. Ogilvy and Morgan's list is in fact an important component of Henry Harbon's Dictionary of London, published in 1917. And Harbon indicates whether the name first occurs on Ogilvy and Morgan or is known earlier, at least from the sources he drew on. And so with this example, as it happens, all of the names of the yards and courts could not be identified by Harbon from sources earlier than 1676. However, other research shows that there was a Richard Hendricks in this part of the parish in 1676, so maybe that's Hendricks Yard, and Cock and Hoop Yard in 1676 could be the same as Cock Yard in Houndsditch Precinct in 1637. But the two inns, the Crown Inn and the Three Nun Inn, are both known from the reign of Elizabeth. And this, of course, illustrates one of the problems with alleys and courts, that their names, as well as their actual forms, could be fleeting and very changeable. So that's certainly a start. Those street directories are a major source for getting back to the street names before the fire. But the records of rebuilding held by the city, including the Foundation's posting book shown here, the Mills and Oliver Foundation surveys, the records of the court established to settle disputes over rebuilding between ground landlords and leaseholders. These are an important source for names current at the time of the fire, as Jones and Redaway pointed out in their introduction to the London Topographical Society volumes. And again, we can cross-check these against Ogilvy and Morgan and Harbon's dictionary. So Scotch Yard off Bush Lane occurs in Ogilvy and Morgan, and Harbon didn't find any earlier entry, but the Foundation's book shows that it was there at the time of the fire. So we can include that in the map. A second major source for street and place names, and one with which many local historians will be familiar, comprises the assessments for the nationwide half tax, established in the early 1660s as part of the Restoration Settlement of Government Finance. For London, we're fortunate to have returns for a large part of the city for Lady Day, the 25th of March, 1665, together with some returns for 1662 to 3 and a return for Westminster in 1664. The map shown here from the published volume of the London and Middlesex half tax indicates the coverage of the 1665 return, But most of the rest of the city is actually covered by 1662-3 or 1664 returns. But I think the real value of the half tax for us is that it covers the whole metropolis, not just the city. The problems, obviously, with the fire rebuilding and with Ogleby and Morgan and Harbin's dictionary are that they cover the city alone. Not all the half tax returns are very detailed, but some give long lists of streets, alleys, and courts that make up a neighbourhood, thus confirming their names and even their existence before the fire. The return for the parish of St Margaret, Westminster, for example, gives some 80 street names, ranging from Codpiece Court to Thieving Lane. And as well as street names, the half tax returns identify the presence of noble residents and premises such as the Inns of Court and Chancery, which we'll certainly be showing on the map. And to patch the gaps where the half tax falls short, we may be able to use other rate lists, which don't have to date from the early 1660s to be useful. If a street is named in a source of, say, the 1630s, and again in 1676, I think we can reasonably assume continuity through the period that we're most interested in. And there are several other potential sources, though the law of diminishing returns will set in at some point. A large-scale and accurate map of early 1660s London will surely be valued by readers of Samuel Pepys's diary, and his diary is itself a source of names and usages. He was, as we know, an inveterate walker or traverser of the metropolis as a whole. And other autobiographical writers of the period, such as John Evelyn, Nehemiah Wallington, Catherine Austen, will also be worth checking. And beyond these, there's a range of sources that are digitized and or indexed and therefore easily accessible, and these will be the most rewarding. But however careful and systematic we are, we will miss some things, and there are depths we cannot sound, such as reading all 2,500 London wills enrolled in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury between 1660 and 1666, for example, not to mention those proved in the London diocesan courts for the same period. Likewise, while it might be tempting to scan early English books online or the English short title catalogue for printers and booksellers' addresses, I think this is beyond us, besides the fact that we probably can't show this level of detail on our map. But certainly searching wills might be a more feasible and rewarding option for a town or city other than London, given a much smaller volume of material to survey. But for this reason, while we will publish a street directory of all the place names on the map with the map, we'll aim also to create an online street directory that can be updated and enlarged as new and independent research is undertaken, and that will allow for corrections and additions. It'll list sources and give the reasons for the decisions that we've made. One problem we will have, of course, and I don't yet know how we're going to resolve it, is which form of any given name we should use. 17th century spelling is far from uniform and standard, and while those who recorded names were obviously literate to some degree, should we take their variant name forms as authentic usages or just the result of a weak grasp of spelling practice? This extract from the half tax for St Giles in the Fields at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road gives some idea of the problem. I guess for this we can look for precedent and practice elsewhere, since the problem isn't unique to London. And I think we'll have to take a line and stick to it, as, for example, family reconstitution has had to do with name forms and linkages, but it won't be straightforward. Finally, other features on the map. Here the question is, what was there? What was it called? What did it look like? The Historic Towns Trust guidance on what the main map should mark includes churches, public buildings, palaces, and major houses, monuments, and other features. This key to the London 1520 map gives some idea of what we'll need to represent and how we will do so. And obviously consistency from one map to another is very important. Whereas we've largely relied on cartographic and documentary sources so far, now we also bring in pictorial sources, and in a few cases, material remains, whether above or below ground. And this part of the work, we'll be relying much more on the research of others. for numerous publications on individual buildings, for example. And one of the great contributors to this, posthumously, is the artist and mapmaker Wenceslas Holler, who was in London from 1636 to 42, and again from 1652 to his death in 1677, and is the source of many of the best views of buildings, streets, and scenes of London before the fire, as well as the maps already mentioned. There are also buildings and representations from a later period, which nevertheless show buildings that were in place before the fire. So there's a profusion of potential sources, and it's important to be quite systematic about how we approach this. And one way is to think in terms of building types, to identify the potential sources for that class of building, and to tick them off one by one. I obviously don't have time today to go through all the different kinds of building, but one feature that any urban map of any date will need to show is churches and places of worship. In 1660, the London Bills of Mortality, shown here on the left, listed 130 parishes, 97 within the walls, 16 immediately outside, north and south of the river, 12 so-called out parishes in Middlesex and Surrey, and 5 Westminster parishes. All of these centred on a parish church, and we'll need to mark the position and, where possible, the footprint and churchyard of each of these. And only a handful of those of the 130 actually lie outside the area that we'll cover. As I've already mentioned, 89 churches were burned in the fire. Many more medieval churches were destroyed or rebuilt in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's already obvious that some, at least, of these are going to fall into the category of plan or position less certain that we had to use for some churches on the Bristol map. But we can also draw on a range of sources. A few depictions of London churches from before the fire of 1666. Some pre-fire churches survived to be pictured, photographed, or planned at a later date. And for the burnt city churches that were not rebuilt, we may still have some clue as to the predecessor church's shape and size. In a few cases, the sites of former churches remained open as subsidiary churchyards or green spaces, and they can be seen on much later maps, including the Ordnance Survey or even today. St Paul's and Westminster Abbey offer different challenges, but in both cases there are plentiful sources. Holler's engravings of old St Paul's before the fire, his engravings of Westminster and the Abbey, plus numerous later plans and views of Westminster Abbey, which of course still stands. Most of these are, of course, depictions, not ground plans, but they can be used in conjunction with maps to recover the footprint of the church building. And plans and pictorial representations of churches are complemented by documentary sources and secondary works. Churchwardens' accounts document church fabric and repairs and rebuildings in the 17th century, and burial registers, just here, may give clues to the layout of church and churchyard. Antiquarians of many periods have much to offer. John Stow's Survey of London, first published in 1598, included brief accounts of the parish churches and their monuments. Later editions of the survey added new information and expanded on Stow's own descriptions. And what's particularly important here is John Strype's 1720 edition of the survey, a massively expanded version with much new material on London churches, some of it dating to before the fire. So while quite a lot of research will be needed for these churches, it's all quite feasible, I think. When it comes to other secular public buildings, while there are some categories with common characteristics, such as livery company halls, the majority are one-offs, each with its own history and bibliography. So it's less easy to generalize about approaches. The key questions, of course, remain. What was there? What was it called? What did it look like? But how we answer them will vary. But we will need to consider royal palaces and properties, such as Whitehall Palace, St James's, the Tower, government buildings such as the Custom House, the mansions of the nobility, such as Somerset House and others along the Strand, civic buildings, including Guildhall and the Royal Exchange, hospitals and almshouses, livery company halls, and the premises of some of the trading companies, and the Inns of Court and Chancery. We may also want to show coaching inns, though I think that taverns and coffee houses would be too ambitious for this. So the sources as before, and as a small sample is shown here, include maps and plans, documentary sources, both primary and secondary, contemporary and later pictorial representations, and the material remains of some pre-fire buildings. London is quite rich in all of these, as the foregoing surely shows, and we're fortunate to have so much easily accessible. And here, I'd like to record my gratitude to the London Topographical Society, whose numerous publications over the years have made this task infinitely easier and more rewarding. Thanks to them, or thanks to the scholars who have edited their publications, anyone can access most of the maps of early modern London, both in sheet form and as A to Z books, the post-fire surveys of Mills and Oliver, historic plans of individual buildings, including the Tower, contemporary views and panoramas, Ralph Treswell's early 17th century house plans, property plans, multiple other early property plans, collections of prints and drawings, and several studies of individual buildings or features from London Bridge to Somerset House. And of course, not least, I am very grateful to the Society for its generous grants that enabled the publication of the medieval and Tudor London maps. So to conclude, as a historian of London, I'm very conscious that it's easy to think of and to present London as exceptional. And in many ways it is, of course, and the early modern period was one in which that exceptionalism was very marked. London grew dramatically when most other British towns were static or declining. Indeed, London absorbed pretty well all the surplus population from the British Isles. It was much wealthier, more diverse in numerous ways, more politically weighty, perhaps more volatile than any other British city of the period. And these characteristics also stimulated the production of a huge volume of sources for the study of London. But I began by stressing the value of comparison to urban and local history. And while the challenges of writing London history, or of seeking to map historic London, derive partly from scale and volume, in many ways, there's much common ground with other localities and other local histories. Though individual instances will vary, we study the same kinds of sources, from maps and property plans to church records to the half tax, and we certainly all value the contribution of antiquarians. Many towns and cities will indeed have much more surviving historical fabric than London itself does. And as historians, we look for answers to the same kinds of questions about urban form, the operations of power, the processes of change. And these questions can, of course, be widened to all kinds of local history, not just urban. Both the Historic Towns Trust and the British Association for Local History work on the basis of collaboration, cooperation, and comparison, and on how we learn from each other. I hope that you have learned something about the Historic Towns Trust and about early modern London, and I look forward myself to learning from other lectures and events in the local history world. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Vanessa. I know that we're going to have plenty of questions coming through in the chat. I don't know if Caroline, you meant to raise your hand just then, but as you are our president, I'll let you have the first question, then we can go into the Q&A. So if you do want to unmute yourself.
Actually, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I was meaning to applaud, but never mind. And if I could just correct, Vanessa was quite right that I'm afraid our maps do need 10 to 15,000 pounds to produce, but you can buy one for 10 pounds. So please buy our maps. But Vanessa, that was absolutely, I learned a tremendous amount from that. And I think one of the things perhaps would be helpful to make clear is what form do you expect this work to take? Are we going to have separate maps that people can pin on their walls, or are we going to have an atlas that they hold in their hands and read?
Well, as you know, this is a question that we're much exercised by. We did originally start by thinking of producing another sheet map, and then we realized that it would have to be the size of a tablecloth, which nobody's going to be able to hold and look at. So we moved on from that to thinking about publishing an atlas, in which doesn't have to be rectangular in form. I mean, the overall shape of London doesn't have to be rectangular. It can be tiled in different sorts of ways. So and that also allows us to publish the extensive street directory that I think we'd need to do. So I think an atlas, a bound volume, is the way we should go. But as we know, I mean, the maps we produce are very appealing physically, very appealing to look at. And it would be a shame if we didn't think that it might be possible to create maps that people could pin on the wall or see that as a kind of byproduct. I think the main focus has to be on the sorry, I can just seeing something going through in the chat. I think the main focus has to be on producing it as an atlas of a manageable size, but who knows what else we might get on to doing.
Thank you.
I think as well, Joe has just put in the chat that he would have a tablecloth if it was. So yes. I think you've got your merchandising and branding sorted for those people who want to buy other map-based things. So I will we've got a few questions coming through, which is wonderful. So I will just also mention that we've got quite a diverse audience this evening. We have people from up in Scotland right down to the Sussex coast this evening. And I would also shout out as someone who's also in the East Midlands and knowing how people from Rutland feel. We've also got people from Rutland as well this evening, and Camden, Canterbury, lots of different places. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I suppose we'll go through the first question in the Q&A section, and I will go back into the chat in just a moment. Please do bear with me. But if you can make sure as much as possible that we put them in the Q&A section just so I can find them easily, that would be great. So the first question is from Florence, who says, are you using the maps of the city wards at this period? I found very detailed precincts of Aldgate, for example, showing houses and alleys to identify where my ancestors were and to collate with the land tax.
Yes, thank you for that question. We're using all the maps that we can find. The difficulty with the ward maps is that they're mostly quite a bit post-fire. They tend to be sort of 1680s, 1690s or early 18th century. So we would certainly use them and look at them, particularly when they might give us a level of detail that we might not get from some of the larger scale maps. So yes, they're part of what we want to look at, but they are a little bit later, so they have to be subject to this process of editing back.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And then,
actually, sorry, can I just say, one of the things that we will do is to mark parish boundaries and ward boundaries on the map. I'm not certain whether we will be able to map precinct boundaries as well. That might be just too much detail.
Thank you very much for that. And then Malcolm has asked, did the Civil War in the 1640s/1650s have much of an impact on the building structure of London?
I think the answer to that is no. We know that there were lines of fortification built in a fairly amateurish way surrounding the whole of London, most of which disappeared within a very few years, though there are some plans that show where they lay. And obviously there may have been an interruption to building projects and building practices during the Civil War, during that period when everything was being devoted and London was being very heavily taxed to pay for the parliamentarian armies. But the city itself is not attacked or not directly attacked. The opposing forces are kept well away from the city, even though it's true the New Model Army occupies London at one stage, but that's a kind of comparatively friendly occupation rather than a devastating one. So I think I would say quite subtle changes, quite subtle impacts overall.
Wonderful. And for those of you who are wondering where to buy the maps, I will also put them in the chat in just a moment. And then Hayden has asked, could you sell two together at a special price? and then we can have the atlases and individual maps to frame. I'm sure that's something that the Historic Towns Trust can consider at their next trustees meeting as part of the ongoing marketing strategy, but keep these different ideas coming. That is,
yes, that's really useful to know what people want to see.
Exactly, absolutely. So it's wonderful to see that there's lots of different options there for the Historic Towns Trust, and I'm sure many of us will be going online now to have a look at the different maps we can buy. And then Joyce has asked, what about boundaries? So many of the old counties have been moved around with electoral areas and things like that.
Well, the boundary of the City of London has hardly changed since the Middle Ages. There was a major readjustment, or a readjustment about 25 years ago in the area around the Barbican, but by and large, the lines that were established in the early Middle Ages by 1270 were still in operation in the time that we're looking at it now. Parish boundaries also are remarkably enduring, that most of the medieval parishes can be mapped with some accuracy. We did have to do quite a lot of toggling between the Ordnance Survey and Ogleby and Morgan, which shows parish and ward boundaries, when we were putting together the parish boundaries for the Tudor London map. But I certainly think that parish boundaries are really important to show. I think ward boundaries for the city, and I think that we can put that amount of detail in without clogging up the map too much. Beyond that, it's county boundaries, and there aren't that many county boundaries that we would need to show on such a map.
Wonderful, thank you very much for that answer as well. And then Robert has asked about how it will relate to the layers of London.
Yes, well, we will work with Layers of London. It will have a digital form, or at least will be created digitally. So I think what we will do is exactly what we have done with the medieval and Tudor maps, which is to make sure that we can give them to Layers of London in a way that they can post them on their site. So while at the moment you can we'll go through the different layers, including our medieval and Tudor maps, what you will in future be able to do is add our London Before the Great Fire map to that as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Patricia's also given an option as a jigsaw puzzles, so I think the marketing team is going to be very...
We've actually been thinking about jigsaw puzzles, it must be said, but whether somebody wants a jigsaw puzzle quite of that size is another question.
And then Sue asked in the chat, to what extent can or has archaeology confirmed the street layout as depicted in the historic maps? Archaeology
has been important in a number of different ways. It's better at the foundations of buildings than continuous street lines, though there are certain places, certain areas where it's been important. I think it's been more valuable in recovering the Roman street plan, which is quite markedly different from the medieval one. So in showing us where the modern lines, where the medieval lines and the Roman lines diverge, archaeology has been very important. It's also done a certain amount among the narrow streets running down to the waterfront. But one of the difficulties is that street layers, street surfaces, tend to be the things that go. So that while you may occasionally get a bit of a street surface, you don't always get enough to give you a very clear sense of where the street is running.
Wonderful, that's so many wonderful answers. Caroline, did you want to come in at that point?
I was going to say, I think, wouldn't you agree, Vanessa, that archaeology was extremely useful for religious houses? I know that.
Oh, yes, yes.
So in a way, it's been more useful perhaps for the medieval city than it is in some ways for the period that you're looking at.
Yes, I mean, well, in a sense, if anything survives of the early modern city in archaeological form, it's usually because it actually had a medieval predecessor.
Yes.
So there are houses still standing in London that themselves date from the 18th century or the 19th century, but that nevertheless have medieval undercrofts or medieval stone foundations. So it's those very solid foundations that can be found underground that are the things that survive, yes. But I do agree with Caroline, yes. Well, actually, it's also true that archaeology has shown us a lot about how the religious houses were dismantled.
Yes.
And how they were then incorporated into different kinds of buildings.
Yes.
But yes.
how they were used after they were dissolved.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And then the last question for this evening I can see is from Tom, who asks, who are the maps intended to be used by?
You, Tom, and everybody else. We hope that anybody who is interested in the history of London, I suppose that's probably the threshold, isn't it? You have to be interested in seeing the past and the present together. But the aim is certainly to make sure that they are as accurate, as scholarly as possible in one sense, but also visually appealing and in a way that they will draw people in to think about the past and to think about the built form and to think about, as it were, how we inhabit the past.
Wonderful. And then John's just jumped in there. So that was the penultimate question. Oh, there's 2 questions coming in. So I'll answer John's first, and then we'll go to Caroline's. So John has asked, how useful are the Survey of London volumes published by the LCC and the London Survey Committee in this task?
Very valuable in different ways. I mean, I've been drawing on, for example, they didn't do very much on the city itself, but there is material, for example, covering the parish of All Hallows Barking. For West London and now for East London, there's an increasing variety of material. And certainly some of the people who work for the Survey of London, like Peter Guillory, have made an enormous contribution to our understanding of the pre-fire built environment. So it's there, the Survey of London volumes, but also some of the other work done by people working for the survey.
Excellent. And then Caroline's put a little post-fire, but please, can you tell me which is the most appropriate map to use when looking at 1695 marriage duty records?
I think probably Ogilvy and Morgan is the best one, and that's the most accessible way to see that is the London Topographical Society's volume that's called The A to Z of Restoration London. I mean, obviously there is some change, but given that the marriage duty returns, that we only have them for the city parishes, Ogilvy and Morgan is more or less big enough to cover that, and that the real changes taking place between 1676 and 1695 are happening further out. So I think I would use Ogilvy and Morgan.
Excellent. And I can just see in the host and panelist chat asking us about the IT we're using. I am just on a laptop today, not even on a second screen, so just so you're aware of that. But I've got multiple tabs open as I'm chatting to Vanessa this evening. But what I will do now is, I'm sure that we've got many questions for Vanessa and the Historic Towns Trust, so do make sure you have a look at their website and look at the maps that are already available. You will have seen slightly earlier this evening, I posted a comment about the 10-minute talk, and also making sure that you can get in touch with Historic Towns Trust and ourselves. Just as a quick one, this is the first of a series of talks this month. So Vanessa has set the bar incredibly high for this talk, as I'm sure we can all agree. So next week, we are joined by Professor Rosemary Sweet. She discusses the invention of a historic town, and that is on Wednesday the 9th at 7 p.m. And all of our talks with Historic Towns Trust this month will be at 7 p.m. on Wednesday evenings. There are various details of upcoming events that can be found on our website, and there is going to be a blog coming out. You may have seen those of you earlier in the chat, and I know I've mentioned him a couple of times now. Joe mentioned that he wants a tablecloth, and he will be writing us a blog within the next week or so that will be published, so do keep an eye out for that. Aside from that, thank you so much this evening, Vanessa, for a fantastic presentation, and to Caroline for doing a wonderful introduction to this series. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us from across the British Isles this evening, and we wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.